Good afternoon, and welcome to From Teeming Zion's Fertile Womb, The Curious Career of Judah Monus, hosted by the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society. My name is Rachel King. I'm the director of the center, and I will be your moderator today. The Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center is a destination for exploring and preserving the history of Jewish families and institutions in New England and beyond. We are an archive, educational center, and family history resource located at New England Historic Genealogical Society, America's founding genealogical organization. Today, we will hear from Professor Michael Hoberman about a fascinating story at the intersection of Jewish and Puritan history. Before we get started, I want to make a few notes about this webinar. The audience will be automatically muted throughout. If you have any questions during Professor Hoberman's presentation, please type them into the questions panel to the right of your screen, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. I also want to note that we're broadcasting remotely today, so please bear with us if we experience technological issues or audible distractions, and we thank you in advance for your patience. Even if we lose the connection or if you miss something on your end, you will have access to the full recording of this session afterward. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Michael Hoberman teaches American literature at Fitchburg State University. He is the author of New Israel, New England, Jews and Puritans in Early New England. His most recent book, 100 Acres of America, The Geography of Jewish American Literary History, was published in 2018 by Rutgers University Press. It was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Title for 2019, and has been favorably reviewed in, among others, the LA Review of Books, Shofar, and Melis Journal. Please join me in welcoming Michael Hoberman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and for your interest and your support of the Jewish Heritage Center. I especially want to thank my friends Stephanie Call, Rachel King, Ginevra Morse at the Jewish Heritage Center for helping to set this up, to publicize it, and running the tech for the program. So we're beginning the talk with this tombstone that you can see in front of you. Among other things, I'll point out in the text that it refers to Judah Monus, a man who was by birth and religion a Jew. It tells his story a little bit, and that's my intention today, is to tell his story. And as we heard in the introduction, the story is worth telling for many reasons, including the fact, from my standpoint, that it brings together two worlds that many of us have thought about as being completely separate from one another. Those would be the worlds of the Jewish people and the worlds of New England Puritans, who thought before that those two worlds might be converged in this way. So we'll go to the next slide here, which is, I think there's just a little bit of a lag between my voice and slides, so please, people, I hope you don't mind that. This is a painting from 1817 by Washington Allston. Head of a Jew is the title it's been given. And I show this slide just to illustrate a significant notion here, which is that Jews were very important. If they weren't in actuality important on a day-to-day basis to early Americans, they were certainly significant in the early American imagination. Washington Allston was a Protestant, South Carolina-born American painter, and he was one of many early Americans who understood Jews to be significant to Protestant thought, but also in his encounters with people. I believe he painted this in London. He discovered that Jews also wandered the modern world in which he lived. Now, how the story of Judah Monus, which I'll be telling today, how it came to my attention in the first place, I'd like to go into a little bit. It goes back into this issue of Jews in the early American imagination. About 10 years ago, I did oral history research and eventually prepared a book on Jewish experience in rural New England. which, by the way, if people don't mind my mentioning, that'll be the subject of my lecture 2 weeks from now. I hope people will come to that. But in any case, I was conducting interviews all over small town New England, and with people of, let's say, anywhere from third, fourth to second generation Jewish people living in New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and so on. And an interesting thing happened to me in the course of that 2-year field project. 2 separate times with 2 different families, I heard the same exact story told. And I want to mention what this story is because it really was a point of origin for the inquiry I'll be bringing up today. The story is basically this, that the storyteller's grandfather, who, let's say, arrived from Russia, somewhere in Eastern Europe, arrived in Maine or Vermont or wherever around 1900, is walking the roads of some rural New England community, selling his materials from a pack that he carries on his back. And in 2 different instances, I think one was indeed from northern Vermont, and the other place I heard the story was from a family somewhere in the Berkshires. 2 different instances, this proverbial Jewish peddler grandfather is not only kindly treated and invited into the New England farmhouse, but when the Yankee, that is the Protestant hosts, realize that this traveling peddler is a Jew, they implore him to please take out from his backpack his Siddur, his Hebrew prayer book, and read out loud to them from it. Now, this is something that is reportedly something that happened around 1900, but the idea is, for me, was that even as late as 1900, Jewish people had a life in the New England imagination, in the Yankee imagination. New England Protestants cared a lot about Jews, were interested in Jews. They didn't necessarily welcome Jews socially, but they were intrigued by the Jewish heritage, and particularly by what they understood to be a sort of Old Testament Hebrew heritage. It goes back to the Puritan era, that fascination. And for 18th century New Englanders, Judah Monus fulfilled the same role in many ways, the same role of this proverbial pack peddler from 1900. So that's why we're telling his story today. Now, eventually, after I heard the story a couple times and I completed my book on early 20th century Jewish immigrants in rural New England, I decided to go and write the prequel to that book, which is my book, New Israel, New England, Jews and Puritans in Early America. And I learned all kinds of things in the course of researching and writing that book. One of the important ideas that came to me fairly early on, and perhaps I've already hinted at this, was that Jews mattered a great deal to Protestants in ways that Protestants didn't necessarily matter to Jews. In other words, Protestants had a whole concept of Jews that was very significant to their own theology throughout the founding periods of New England history. Jews might have cared about Protestants, but certainly not in the same, they didn't have the same theological fascination. The job that I attempted to do in writing New Israel, New England was, in a sense, to, as I might put it, to square the sort of imaginary thought dreams that New England Puritans had about Jews and about Jewish history and Jewish heritage and Jewish texts and Talmud and Kabbalah and all kinds of Jewish materials that at least their ministers were familiar with. What happened when those thought dreams converged with actual encounters with real Jews? Because there were Jews who settled North America, British North America, as we know, in this period, in the 17th and 18th century. Just to put some numbers on it, a figure that's often given is around the time of the American Revolution, there were probably 2,500 Jews in British North America, which speaks nothing of the much larger numbers of Jewish settlers who were in the Caribbean. Now, in New Israel, New England, I look at a series of encounters between typically Protestant ministers, Protestant theologians, first mostly with Jewish texts, as I mentioned before, Old Testament scholarship by Jews that they were interested in, Protestant ministers who studied Hebrew, sometimes from Protestant Hebraic instructors, and sometimes the case eventually developed, from Jews themselves. Eventually, when you get to the time of just at least preceding the American Revolution, you have actual encounters between actual people that become very interesting. And the one that's pictured here on the cover of the book, and there's a close-up in the next slide. I'll just mention these two figures briefly. The portraits look similar because, by the way, they're by the same portrait artist, somebody named Samuel King from Newport, Rhode Island. But he painted the portrait on the left of Chaim Carrigal in around 1781, and the painting of the man on his right, Ezra Stiles, was prepared in 1771. These two men became friends, personal friends, intellectual friends, and corresponding friends. That is, after the period of time that they were actually together in Newport, which was for about 5 months during Carrigal's visit to Newport in 1773, they continued on a correspondence, some of which was in Hebrew, by the way, for a few years afterwards. Carrigal ended up dying shortly after he left Newport. But in any case, this encounter is sort of the culmination of my study of Jews and Puritans in the flesh, that is, meeting one another. I'll say just a little bit more about the book as a whole and some of the framing ideas before I get to our main character today, Judah Monus. I reached a bunch of sort of interrelated conclusions in writing New Israel, New England, but the primary conclusion that I reached, it goes back to the point I made a few minutes before about how Protestants were fascinated by Jews and Jewish history. And the reason they had this fascination in the first place, according to my way of figuring things, had to do with their need to fulfill a certain number of balances in their lives. Puritanism was a Calvinistic theology. That is, it believed in very strongly. Calvinism is a predestinarian teaching, which suggests that every human being is born with their fate decided by God ahead of time. And so the life of a Calvinist can be a psychic challenge from day to day through an entire lifetime, because this person never knows whether he or she is saved or damned. And given the enormous emotional and psychological burden that that sort of theology imposed on its practitioners, Puritans, in order to uphold that, found it difficult to create balances in their lives between, I'll just mention a couple sort of tensions, sets of tensions that govern their lives. On the one hand, what would be more important in Puritan social existence? The piousness of a single individual and that person's personal relationship with God on the one hand, or would it be communal order, which is necessary for social things to take place? What would be more important? Another set of balances: a belief in covenantal precedent, in legalism, in testimonial law as brought forth in the Bible and so on the one hand, or a strong belief in divine grace, which might transcend laws and regulations. How would you balance out, additionally, the importance on the one hand of faith, that is, your assumption that God will make the right things happen on his own time, on the one hand, or the need for human action? And these things, these balances were very difficult to achieve. So to bring it back to Jews, my understanding in my study was that when Puritans studied Jewish history, when they encountered Jewish texts, when they interacted with Jewish scholars and rabbis, they helped to try to alleviate the tensions that they found. These studies on their part helped them to try to sort out these difficult dilemmas that they faced. And Judah Monus arrives exactly at a pivotal moment for late stage Puritans, when they're having a great deal of difficulty working out the proper balances between these things I mentioned before. So I want to go now to just a story, the story of Judah Monus as far as we know it, his biography, the bits and pieces of his life story that we can tell. I'm going to do that first, and then I'll reflect briefly on how historians have interpreted the story. And then I'm going to offer 4 separate ways that I propose that we should look at his story and try to put it in the proper context. And appreciate its importance. But to go to the story itself. So the man Judah Monus, the man who's buried where that tombstone is in Northborough, was born in Italy in 1683. It's quite likely, from recent points that scholars have made, it's quite likely that his parents themselves had come to Italy from North Africa. They were Sephardim, that is, they were the progeny of people whose families had left Spain and Portugal in the aftermath of the Inquisition. And North Africa, Algeria, was one place where Jews had, they lived second-class citizenship existence, but they were accepted there on a certain level. And so it's understood that Monus's parents lived there, were born there, but then that they found their way to Italy. And I want to mention briefly a recent piece of documentation that's only very recently come to light. It's a ketubah that my friend and colleague Brian Ogren, he's a professor of religion at Rice University, he found in a museum in Israel a ketubah for David and Rachel Monus from 1679 in Livorno in Italy. Monus is a pretty rare name, and so I think Brian is most likely correct in conjecturing that these two people are Monus's parents. So I think we can fairly safely assume that his parents are these two people, that they're married in Livorno. He's born there in 1683. He studies Jewish law in Livorno, which was a great site of Jewish theology at that time. And then he makes his way to Amsterdam, which was a very significant place for, particularly for, initially for Sephardim and then Ashkenazim to study and to settle. He studied with Jacob Sesportus. We just saw his slide a moment ago. This is a person that Monus identifies as a rabbi of his from his early years. He studied here at Etz Chaim. Now, the picture you see here is what Etz Chaim in Amsterdam looks like now. It today is a very large collection of Sephardic bibliographic sources, but at one time it was a yeshiva at the time that Judah Monus was in Amsterdam. Many Jews who ended up in North America came here by way of London. I've seen some historians conjecture that Monus might have gone from Amsterdam to London. If he had, he would likely have been affiliated or at least passed through the community that's represented here. This is the famous Bevis Marks, otherwise known as the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, built in 1704. It's on the eastern side of London. Worth a visit if you're traveling in London, for sure. The next slide shows us an image of the interior. And this is whether Monus was here or not, may not matter, because it's just a nice way for us to see what the worship conditions of Sephardic Jews were at this time. This would have been the worship environment in which a person like Judah Monus would have spent his early years. It's not clear how long he was in London, but what we do know is that he arrives in New York in February of 1715. And to my knowledge, no historian has really developed any sense yet of why he made this obviously quite significant journey. I would also speculate, I haven't seen any way to substantiate this, but later in his life, Monus told people that he had been, I think he referred to himself as a rabbi in Jamaica. Of course, there's no records in Jamaica, which had, by the way, a large Jewish community. There are no records of his having passed through, let alone served as a rabbi there. But it's possible that he arrived in New York by way of Jamaica. I don't know how else we would take his claim that he spent in Jamaica. That's the one time it would make sense that he would have been there. So he spends 4 years in New York. And while he's in New York, the evidence that we have for his time there, again, there's the paper that shows us his time of arrival. He's admitted as a freeman, which is to say a certain kind of small-time merchant. But there's also a body of correspondence between himself and a Hebrew scholar, Samuel Johnson. It's not the famous English writer Samuel Johnson, but a different Samuel Johnson who studied Hebrew, was one of several eminent scholars of Hebrew at the time in British North America. This Samuel Johnson eventually goes on to be a founder of King's, later Columbia College. And the correspondence between Monus And Johnson, what I understand about it, I want to mention another current scholar for more or less tipping me off to this. This is my friend and colleague Israel Ben-Porat, who is a current PhD candidate at CUNY, who studied Monus. It seems as though at the time that Monus is corresponding with Samuel Johnson, he's telling Johnson that he is a scholar of Hebrew. He understands that Johnson is a scholar of Hebrew, but there's nothing in the correspondence between them to betray any notion that Monus is about to convert to Christianity. In other words, he explains himself in non-Trinitarian terms. He speaks, his writing suggests that he is a practicing Jew. He might very well, while he was in New York, have been a private teacher. If he was, he wouldn't have gone in this building because this building didn't exist until 1730, but he would have gone into wherever that congregation, Sherith Israel, which was the New York Jewish congregation at this time, basically a New York extension of Bevis Marks. He would have served its congregants as a private teacher if that's in fact what he was doing. All of this changes, the big dramatic change in Monus's life, these changes begin to occur. Well, there's been some drama already. He's already gone from Italy to London and now to New York, but now the big change and the reason we're talking about him today occurs. Around June 1720, he, again, he's a scholar of Hebrew. He wants to parlay his abilities as a Hebrew grammarian to people who can appreciate and recompense him for his services. And he understands, he intuits that people at Harvard might be interested in his skills. So Judah Monus ends up gravitating towards Cambridge, Massachusetts. We have records that he purchased a house on Cornmarket Street in Cambridge in September 1720. This same mortgage was canceled 4 years later upon his marriage to a local Protestant woman, Abigail Merritt. I guess her dowry probably made it possible to cancel that mortgage. But in any case, we know we can attach him to Cambridge in 1720. And to go back to June of 1720, it's at this time that he writes to officials at Harvard to tell them something similar to what he was telling Johnson back in New York, which is that he is an accomplished Hebrew grammarian and that he is eager to offer his services to people who might appreciate them. As Monis put it in the letter, he's eager to serve as a teacher to, quote, the learned gentlemen and dissenters of different churches. I forgot to mention, but you can see for yourself, this is what Harvard looked like in 1720. So this was an established learning institution for sure, and Hebrew was very highly prized here. When Monis, by the way, when he refers to dissenters of different churches, I just want to briefly touch on that. What he means by that is that he has an awareness of how Protestantism works, and he understands that in New England, the majority of Protestants are indeed dissenters. That is, they are not Anglicans, they are not Church of England people. They are primarily Congregationalists, and Congregationalists would be the offshoots, the early to mid 18th century versions of what a few generations earlier people were referring to as Puritans. In 1722, he receives his master's degree from Harvard, quite likely in exchange for this grammar that he had shown the Harvard officials. And he is indeed the first Jew to receive a degree from Harvard because he was still a Jew when he got that degree. Now, a big other change occurs just a few short months later. March 27th, 1722, he has a big public conversion center at the First Cambridge Church. And we'll see in the next slide some discourses that he published in coincidence with that conversion ceremony. It's a tripartite discourse, that is 3 parts. The truth is part 1, the whole truth is part 2, and nothing but the truth is part 3. And all 3 parts of these discourses, which I think the English in the discourses would suggest that Monis had considerable assistance, because the English that he shows in his letters is somewhat halting, and whereas these discourses are very clearly and fluently written. But the ideas in them seem to have certainly some basis in Monus's own knowledge and experience as a Jew, because the purpose of the discourse is they're not just to declare his conversion to Christianity, they're to declare the Jewish basis for his conversion. In other words, he understands and he articulates through the course of this it's about a 200-page pamphlet if you put it all together. He articulates all of the Jewish underpinnings and all of the things that he's learned in his various episodes at various yeshivot, things that he's learned in Judaism, including from Kabbalah, that have caused him now in 1722 to see the light of Christ. So after the conversion, I'm going to use a term from a few months ago that you may remember, quid pro quo. Remember that one? Well, is it a quid pro quo? Was it the case that the conversion was a condition for his appointment at Harvard? There's no literal quid pro quo there. In other words, there's no piece of paper there that we can point to, but it seems the circumstantial evidence would suggest that it is some kind of a quid pro quo. But in any case, he conducts a 38-year career at Harvard. He taught there from 1722 until he retired in 1760. And so on that basis, he taught several generations of Harvard students along the way. One of those Harvard students was a man named John Cotton. Again, I want to draw a distinction. There's a famous John Cotton who was a 17th century Massachusetts minister. This is a different man, a man of a later generation. In any case, this man was somebody who studied Hebrew with Monus at Harvard. And this is his hand-copied version of the grammar. Why it's hand-copied is that early students of Monus's, the only way they could acquire his grammar was by copying out by hand their own version of it. It wasn't until 1735 that a printed version came out. This version, by the way, this is in the collection, the John Cotton version is in the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is where I first encountered it when I was doing research for my book. There are about a half a dozen or so. I might be wrong about that, but there are some others floating around out there. I know that the American Antiquarian Association has one or two. Harvard has one or two. So this is one of a few of these hand-copied versions. In any case, 1735, I mentioned, the book comes out in print, and the reason people had to wait that long was that there was no set of Hebrew type in order to print it until 1735. Now, over the course of this fairly long career at Harvard, Monus seems to have weathered a fair amount of disappointment. And the reason that I come to this conclusion, other historians have come to this conclusion, is largely on the basis of correspondence that we find between him and, for instance, various Harvard authorities. He's often asking for raises. He's maybe reluctantly given a smaller raise than the one he asks for. He writes letters complaining about bills that he has to pay, that he's in arrears, that his salary is not commensurate with the service he provides. He, at a certain point fairly early on in his teaching career, he was advised that he should not attempt to discipline students. So apparently he had disciplinary problems in his classes, but the Harvard authorities suggested that they would step in if there were disciplinary problems. And later on in his career, there's testimony on the part of former students to suggest that he had been, at least later on in the later decades of his career, he was the target of a certain amount of harassment at the hands of disgruntled students. I don't think we can necessarily conclude from that what that means. Was he, did students harass him because they still thought of him as a Jew and they didn't like Jews? Maybe. Did they harass him because he was not a very effective instructor? Maybe. It's not something that I think we can resolve. The other reason that it seems as though Monus, as I say, sustained some disappointment during his career, the other basis for that is a fair amount of litigious material that we can find in court records. Monus was involved in several, relatively small lawsuits between himself and neighbors here and there. So he seems to have experienced a certain amount of discontent during his life. As I mentioned before, he dies in 1764. He spent the last 3 years of his life in Northborough at the home of his brother-in-law, John Marrett. And as I get to near the end of the actual biography, I do want to mention some things that, in a sense, contradict some points I made just a moment ago about his disappointment, and that is that the will that he left shows that Monus was not exactly impoverished. He left behind quite a legacy, a large library. He had a lot of furnishings. He had property. And we also know that from the 1740s onward, he was a slave owner. He didn't own a lot of slaves. He owned, I think, at most 2 or 3 slaves. But the reason this matters from my standpoint has to do with the fact that as a slave owner in Cambridge, he was a member of an elite. There were not a lot of slave owners in that town in 1740 or so, and people who did own slaves existed at on the highest margins of society. So maybe some of that complaining goes against some of the realities of his economic existence. And I'm going to come back at the end of my talk to reflect a little bit more on his financial profile. We started out with the tombstone. I'm going to go back to that now, just to call attention to the poem that's inscribed on it. In some ways, this poem is really a perfect and very insightful summary of the life that I just recounted for you. I'll read the main part of the inscription, a poem that reads, "A native branch of Jacob's sea, which once from off its olive broke, regrafted from the living tree of the reviving sap partook. From teeming Zion's fertile womb, as dewy drops in early morn, or rising bodies from the tomb, be Israel's nation born." Some things I want to call attention to about this poem. For one thing, you'll note the scripted biblical allusions. This is a common thing, of course, but you'll note that 3 of the allusions are from the Hebrew Bible, 2 of them are from the New Testament. So this is a poem that pays homage to both faith traditions, you could say. But the other thing about it that strikes me is how significant, whoever wrote this poem, how significant Monus's Jewish heritage was to their sense of who he was as a person and as a Christian. So we have the reference to him being a native branch of Jacob. We have the reference that I used for my title today, from Teeming Zion's fertile womb. We have references that suggest that this man was born a Jew, and that his being born a Jew, and for that matter, as we've talked, as I've mentioned before, his having studied as a Jew, that is significant to his identity upon his death of being a Christian, that these 2 things are powerfully and significantly related to one another. So that brings me to the end of the biography, and now I want to talk about what it means and why it's important, and how, but first, how it's been interpreted. The first historian to talk about Judah Monus is a woman named Hannah Adams. Her slide will come up in just a moment. And she was one of several historians who wanted to, quote unquote, make sense of Monus, to figure out who he was, why he did what he did, and to understand the importance of his legacy. Adams was a Massachusetts historian. She wrote a 2-volume history of the Jews after the Bible. And not surprisingly, because she was from Massachusetts, she was interested in what permutations of Jewish life existed in North America at the time of her writing, and also before she wrote her book. And so she must have poked around a little bit. She picked up on one detail that has sort of made its rounds through the generations of historical accounts of Monus, and that is that there was talk among neighbors during Monus's lifetime that then continued on through the oral tradition, that Monus, even after his conversion, maintained the Jewish Sabbath. Now, why that would matter, I think that's an open question. Of course, he wouldn't have been the only Protestant who worshipped on the Jewish Sabbath. Seventh-day Adventists in large numbers do that to this day. So worshiping on the Jewish Sabbath doesn't necessarily by any means negate his belief in Protestantism. But since the time of Adams, historians, several generations of them, have gone back and forth on many of the same questions. They want to know why he converted. And maybe some of them are arguing that he converted because he saw an opportunity to advance himself professionally. Or maybe he converted because he really thought that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. And then those who look carefully at his conversion want to know, well, did he really become a believing Christian? Those who looked at the Jewish Sabbath thing might have thought, well, no, not really. He was, he practiced almost like a Marrano, like a secret Jew behind the closed doors of his house. But other people would say, well, no, he had really seen the light of Jesus Christ. And there's certainly plenty of testimony to that effect, not only in Monis's own writing, that he was a believing Christian, but on the part of many of his neighbors and people who were members of the same church, that he from the moment of his conversion to his death really maintained Christianity pretty strongly. Now, more recently, that is, let's say in the last 25, 30, 40 years, scholars, I think, have turned their attention to what I would consider to be if certainly more consequential, but also maybe more answerable questions. These first set of questions are impossible to answer, but some questions we can ask that are open-ended enough that maybe some light can be shed on them. For instance, why does his story matter in the bigger picture, which is kind of the question that motivates me? How can the story of Judah Monis shed light on the stories we tell about early Jewish American history? And what does his story tell us about relationships, particularly between Jews and Protestants in the 18th century throughout the Atlantic world? For my part, I've always been curious since I first came across his story. I've always wanted to try to understand how his story can help us to better understand what happened to Puritanism in its later stages. That is, from the early and middle decades of the 18th century to the American Revolution. What happened to that faith in New England? And in what ways did a waning Puritan orthodoxy or latter-day Puritan orthodoxy of mid-18th century New England seek to use the conversion of a person like Judah Monis as an opportunity to revive its own lagging spirits? I'm also interested in talking about him and talking about his story as a better way, as I guess I've hinted at this a little bit already, to understand the complex religious and cultural environment of the Atlantic world. Now, in pursuit of this last set of questions and this idea of the Atlantic world, I'm going to talk to 4 specific themes that I think his story can help us to highlight. And this will open up some new avenues of inquiry and some sort of historical patterns that I haven't talked about yet before. So first of all, Judah Monis's conversion in 1720 and his career afterwards, it follows from a long-standing interest on the part of New England Puritans and Atlantic world Puritans in general and Protestants in what they called a national conversion of the Jews, and the ways in which that national conversion of the Jews would be a presaging of a second coming of Christ. Now, when they said national conversion, what they meant by that was that the Jews of all nations, the Jews having been scattered to the 4 corners of the world, that they had some hope, as had been prophesied, that the Jews would all convert wherever they were, and that sign, that conversion would point in the direction of a second coming happening sooner rather than later. As far back as the founding of Massachusetts Bay in the 1630s, Puritans on both sides of the Atlantic were projecting their hopes and expectations for a second coming. This period during which New England was settled was in many ways, for Protestants, kind of a messianic and mystical age. All kinds of fantastic things were happening in the world, and all of a sudden, owing partly to the ability with which people could travel back and forth across the Atlantic, the news got around. So the activities and presence of Jews in various parts of the world were significant. Again, they were a prerequisite for the second coming. This national conversion was going to culminate then in an ingathering of Jews back to the Holy Land. And New England Puritans were among many Protestants throughout the Atlantic world who looked to this. Monus, when he comes a few decades later, this is the environment in which he is arriving. Now, the existence of the New World, of course, complicated the formulations of people who were thinking through this second coming. One of the people who thought and wrote about this a fair amount was Samuel Sewell. He might be familiar to people in the Boston area. He was a resident of Brookline and also gained some fame throughout his career, but especially in 1692, he was one of the Salem witch judges. He was incidentally the only one of the Salem witch judges who apologized publicly afterwards for condemning those people for witchcraft. But in 1697, so 5 years after Salem, he wrote a pamphlet called Phenomena Quaedam Apocalyptica. And in that pamphlet, where he's reflecting on all the indications and signs of the second coming, he wrote with some excitement about how Jews were in fact to be found throughout the Americas. He wrote, very considerable numbers of Jews are seated in the New World where they merchandise, have their synagogues and places of burial. He made special mention of Jamaica, which we'll see in the next slide, as a place of significant Jewish settlement. He was right on that. There were groups of Jews settling here as early as the later decades of the 17th century. And so Sewell was on, he may not have been onto something regarding the second coming, but he certainly was onto something that the New World was becoming an attractive place for Jews to come to. Now, another sort of complicating but also enriching factor here in this whole idea of looking to the second coming and looking for Jews everywhere in the world has to do with a phenomenon that people have referred to as the Jewish Indian theory. And that is the idea that goes back to really the 16th century that many Protestants and also Catholics and some Jews even had, which was that the Indians themselves, Native Americans, were the lost 10 tribes. Writers throughout the Atlantic world found evidence that Native peoples were in fact remnants of the dispersed Jews of the ancient world. This evidence in some cases included ethnography and linguistic study. One of the more noteworthy students of this topic was Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, who studied Wampanoag, was also a scholar of Hebrew. He found quite a few correspondences between Wampanoag and Hebrew, and he also noted situations in which Jewish religious practices resembled native practices that he observed and vice versa. Now, one last aspect of this sort of messianic theme here, and this goes to our next slide. Shabbatai Tzvi, who was in 1666 a Jew born in the Ottoman world, he declares himself to be the Jewish Messiah. And around the time that he declares this, it's not clear how many Jews, but significant numbers of Jews sort of rally to his cause, believe that he is the Jewish Messiah. And news reports got out that Jews, particularly in the Ottoman world, were sort of flocking to his coattails and heading from wherever they were to the land of Israel. Now, he eventually is outed as not the Messiah, and this whole thing passes away. But Protestants and New England writers, including particularly, I want to mention Increase Mather, president of Harvard, pays attention to this. I also want to point out that the same friend I mentioned earlier, Brian Ogren of Rice University, is somebody who's just very recently brought this story of Tzvi's claims being significant to New England Puritans. He's just written about this, and I think his book on this subject will be coming out fairly soon. That's Brian Ogren. So anyway, all of this adds up to suggest that when Monus arrives in the 1720s, he's arriving into a world where Jews mattered an awful lot to Protestants. This is something I'd mentioned earlier. Monus may only have been one person, but his conversion occurred within a milieu that had been anticipating things like his conversion for over 100 years. Protestants watched Jews. They paid attention to Jews in news of Jews throughout the world. Their newspapers carried that news, and so this is partly why Monus mattered to New Englanders. Now, another point I want to make, let's say theme number 2, why his story matters. Monus arrives at a perfect time to, and I think I've alluded to this before, he arrives at a perfect time to help to revive the faith of the New England founders, right? In 1720, we're looking at almost 100 years of continual settlement on the part of Puritans in New England. And church authorities by this time are losing their grip. Some of them may feel like they need a dose of old-time religion. And for Puritans or their progeny in the early to mid 1700s, that old-time religion by definition was Hebraic. Cotton Mather, who's featured in our next slide, he knew Monus, was interested in Monus's story, and a person like Cotton Mather cared a lot about Monus because he was one of these people who I think probably believed that the conversion of Monus might help to inject some of this fervor of the founding generation, re-inject it into waning congregations in the early 1700s. In fact, the term faith of the fathers is significant. Cotton Mather publishes a conversion pamphlet with that title. The purpose of the pamphlet ostensibly was to convert Jews to Christianity. It seems quite unlikely that any Jews ever read that pamphlet, or that if they had, they would have taken it seriously. But a more likely reason that he wrote the pamphlet and entitled it Faith of the Fathers was that he was really talking about converting weak Protestants back into strong Protestants, and that the fathers in question were not just the Jews who were the fathers of Christianity, but the fathers meaning the John Winthrops and John Cottons and members of the earliest generation of Puritan settlement. There's an interesting article that comes out in the New England Current newspaper in 1722 that puts words to this. The opinion is that given that, quote, the Jews' obstinacy in defense and practice of their religion could only condemn our coldness and indifferency in ours. In other words, Protestants, Congregationalists in the 1720s were worried that their faith, their people's faith was waning, and they were actually looking to the example of the Hebrew Bible Jews as being people who were obstinate, who really held firm to their faith. So a person like Monus arrives just at the right time for this. In various places, as congregational authority weakens, as various institutions like the Brattle Street Church here in Cambridge, pictured, were increasingly willing to dispense membership on the terms dictated by members rather than on the basis of a rigorous testimony of faith and salvation that would have been required in an earlier generation. This adds to this feeling of congregational authority loosening and weakening. At the same time, historians have pointed out there was a smallpox outbreak around this time, 1722, I believe, that killed about almost 10% of Boston's residents. We know what it feels like to undergo something like that, and particularly the threat that it poses to social order. There also at this time is the ever-present menace of the French in Canada and their Indian allies. And then to add insult to injury, in 1722, 7 members of the Yale faculty announced that they were going to convert to Anglicanism. That is, they were going to no longer be dissenters. Of course, Anglicanism is anathema to people of Puritan stock and heritage. So for all of these reasons, Monus's arrival and his conversion, maybe it felt important to people as a reassertion of the colony's Hebraic roots, certainly for a person like Cotton Mather. Now, a third point I'll make has to do with the conversion itself and the ceremony and why certain people were, let's say, uncomfortable with that ceremony. His conversion, Monus's conversion in 1722, dramatized challenges that were inherent to the whole notion of promoting, promulgating, and trying to revive a faith that from the very start was quite elusive. That is Calvinism. Calvinism places so much importance on stress on the importance of internal experience, and yet Monus's conversion, as performed in a ceremony in a church in Cambridge in March of 1722, was a very external event. The slide that you see here is just an example of one, I think this is an English Puritan's sort of confession, first-person confessional. So there's so much in Puritanism that's about self-examination, and yet in Monus's case, he seemed to be given license to announce his conversion publicly. That kind of goes against the grain of what Puritanism had once stood for. For Calvinists, conversion was an ongoing process that was never fully resolved. And so doubts surrounding the public conversion of a Jew dramatized what I would call the crisis of third-generation Puritanism. No Christian could be assumed to be converted from one point to another, so why should it be possible for this Jewish man to announce a conversion instantaneously? His event was a public One, as I mentioned, it was for some people equivalent to a baptism, which is what we see represented on the left here, or a bris. We see a circumcision. He declared the resemblance between his ceremony and these types of ceremonies in his discourses, and yet Calvinism itself was not supposed to be so easily transferable. It wasn't a matter of just announcing something and all of a sudden being taken at your word that you had truly converted. Incidentally, I think that the difficulty of parlaying Calvinist theology to people, the difficulty of translating it and explaining it and popularizing it would help us to better understand why Puritans did not succeed in converting large numbers of Indians in New England, whereas Catholics in Quebec did with very large numbers. It was much easier to bring about those conversions when the conversion within the Catholic world really was a public ceremonial moment. Monus's conversion for New Englanders offered confirmation of the waning influence of an untenable founding belief in Calvinism. A conversion not just of Jews, but of ordinary Christians had been a central focus for New England congregations for years, and the lack of assurance that had once defined the Puritan journey toward confirmation in Christ couldn't be maintained without some gesture in the direction of a more covenantal, that is, a more public external practice. But these public assertions were and had to be automatically suspect. And so I would argue that Monus's embodiment of a kind of covenantal version of Christianity, an external version of Christianity, would strain belief and tenability for Protestants. And it certainly did for some people. There were people on both sides of the Atlantic who doubted the authenticity of his conversion, and in the sense that his conversion went against the precedent for what it truly meant to be a Calvinist. I can see where those people were coming from. Why should a person who had spent his entire life up until the point of his conversion denying the divinity of Christ on the basis of a single ceremony be able to parade around and announce that he was a Christian? One of the things that this brings to mind, we'll go to the next slide, is, again, I want to go back to this idea of one of the central tensions within Puritan theology, and that is the tension between an individual relationship with God that is of great importance to Calvinists, and at the same time a need for a social compact. And Anne Hutchinson's trial, which takes us back 100 years, is a perfect example of how this tension manifested periodically throughout the history of the Puritans in New England. Anne Hutchinson was put on trial for questioning the preaching of certain ministers. She accused certain ministers of preaching a covenant of works as opposed to a covenant of grace. And when she was on trial, she was asked why she, what her basis was. Well, she said her basis for that claim was a personal revelation. When she announced that, that's exactly the point at which she was declared to be guilty and exiled from Massachusetts. She was only enunciating something that was intrinsic to Puritanism. In other words, Anne Hutchinson out-Puritaned the Puritans, and which is exactly why they kicked her out, because they could only take so much of their own theology before it threatened social equilibrium, not the least of which points, of course, here is that she was a female stepping out of bounds. So the last theme I want to mention in terms of Monus's story and why it matters has to brings us back to this topic of economic relationships and the interweaving of religious and financial considerations. The one aspect of Judah Monus's story that I don't think has really been satisfactorily interpreted up until now is the economic dimension and the implications of that dimension toward our overall understanding of colonial era history. In the same way that the Puritan Revolution was very much a product of Northwestern European economic expansion, the movement to Jews to North America and the Caribbean occurred within a similar context. It was an economic movement. And my concluding points bring us back to this idea. Now, there's always been a strong historical consensus on the part of people who study Jewish history in the Americas that Jews came to North America and to the Caribbean in their capacity as merchants. They didn't come here in the same way that we've been told the Pilgrims came here for religious freedom. They came here to conduct their mercantile activities and to, to be tolerated as Jews, but they weren't inspired to come here by religious visions in the same way that the pilgrims claim to have been inspired. So the reason that Monus seems like an outlier is that he goes against that. He seems in some way to be the only Jew who came to North America for religious reasons. But we should bear in mind that teaching Hebrew is not just a theologically significant event. It's not just a significant point from a religious standpoint, but it's an economic activity as well. He might not have gotten rich at it, but the evidence is certainly clear that, as I mentioned before, he had a decent livelihood. He established himself as a member of the local elite in Cambridge, and he was successful enough to leave behind a financial as well as a religious legacy. Our next slide reminds us of one aspect of his legacy, which is that he was a slave owner. This is not his will, but this is a will of another Cambridge resident at this time, right? And so in Monus's will, he also is bequeathing a Negro wench. That might not have been his exact terms for it. In other words, he achieved financial success by virtue of his religious and academic activity, particularly within the context of what historians have referred to as the print revolution, that is the circulation of published materials back and forth across the Atlantic, and the Protestant International, that is the movement of Northwestern Europeans, again, on both sides of the Atlantic, and their conducting of a commerce that eventually built in the direction of a Protestant empire, an Anglo-American empire, if you will. Monus's emergence as a published author should not be written off just as a curiosity. The burgeoning of this transatlantic market economy wasn't just a matter, of exploiting slave labor to extract natural resources or turning natural resources into consumer goods. What we see in Monus's story is an example of a resourceful individual finding an appropriate market for his natural resource, which is his intellectual accomplishment, and he finds a professional outlet for his religious expertise and training. So I think that with considerable justification, there's a critic of Jewish American literature, Michael Kramer, who has argued for some time that Monus's discourses that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, they in some ways might be said to be the beginnings of Jewish American literature. I think the basis for Kramer's argument is pretty solid in the sense that that set of discourses is an early example of a Jewish-born individual relating to America through language and parlaying language as his professional activity. This next slide here also speaks to the influence that Judah Monus had as a scholar and as a professional. This is another copy of his of his grammar. This copy belonged to Samson Occam. And Samson Occam, some of you may have heard about, was a fairly well-known New England minister, born Pequot in Connecticut, practiced as a minister for several decades. He did not go to Harvard. He didn't study with Judah Monus. He studied at Dartmouth, which was then ostensibly an Indian school, and yet he owned a copy of Monus's grammar. In other words, Samson Occam, people all over the Atlantic world had access to this grammar, were influenced by this grammar. So Monus made his mark as a practitioner of the academic profession in North America, and that's an economic activity. It's not just, excuse me, it's not just a religious outlet. So I'm going to conclude here and just make some last points here. The question I've been asking, why the story matters. Why does this story of this one early American Jew who, in some ways, fairly truthfully, we could say he wasn't even a Jew. Why does the story matter? Why should it merit attention? Why does it capture the imagination? I've tried to sum up some of the ways in which it sheds light on larger subjects, including the ways in which the Puritans' interests in Hebraic materials complicated their lives, how their participation in a transatlantic world economy exposed them to a diversifying cultural landscape, and ways in which religious affiliation deepens and enriches their cultural identity. It's difficult to arrive at fully satisfying answers to any of these questions, and that's partly because the evidence is so scant and fragmentary. Nonetheless, I think every historian who's tried to tell the story has shed at least a little light on it by virtue of their careful readings of these bits and pieces of evidence. And I think that that process alone is valuable. It might not unlock any secrets, it might not bring any revelations, but it does teach us some valuable lessons about how the mysteries and intrigues of individual experience can and often do, certainly in Monus's case, reduce the impact of large-scale historical trends to which we typically pay attention. Monus is a figure on the margins. He's a liminal figure. He exists between worlds. He combines, to go back to my earliest point, he combines these two worlds that we think of as having been separate, and he belongs to both of them and neither one of them simultaneously. In some ways, he was a practicing and educated Jew and at the same time a believing Christian. In some ways, he was, in symbolic terms, a Jewish father who was conferring his ancient Jewish covenant upon his Christian students, and at the same time, he was a Christian son receiving God's good news from the New Testament. He was a teacher. His tombstone refers to him as a rabbi. That's what the local New Englanders called him, as a rabbi. In any case, Jews didn't call him that, but his neighbors in Northborough did. He was a teacher to whom many referred to as a rabbi, and at the same time, he was a student of the New Testament and its message. And we go back at the end here to the Washington Alston slide. He was a Jew, and he was also at the same time the Jew. Thanks very much, and I'm eager to go on to questions in the aftermath. I appreciate your time.
Michael, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. Before we get to a few questions from you in the audience, I do want to mention another talk by Michael Hoberman, which he mentioned, that is coming up in 2 weeks. On June 30th, we present Jewish Life in Rural New England, How the Jews Got to Mars Hill, Maine, and Other Stories from the Field. Just as it was for this webinar, registration is free. We hope you'll join us again. Now let's turn to a few questions from the audience. Let's see, Michael asks, what do we know or surmise about the status of Monus's marriage prior to his conversion? And I think I had the same question, as you mentioned an Abigail to whom he married, and what can you tell us about that?
I haven't found very much about, what their courtship was like, how they met, or anything like that. But the suggestion has been made. I was looking through some of the earlier scholarship earlier today, and I saw that there are some historians who do conjecture that. I think this is something that you asked me about last week. Was the conversion? Did that happen because he wanted to marry Abigail? Was it a love first and then religion story? Maybe it was. But it's hard, the merits show up in town records and so on, but there isn't very much personal testimonial material on the relationship between these two. Certainly the Merritt family was devoted to Monus, and late in his life, as I mentioned, he spent the last 3 years of his life in Northborough living with his brother-in-law. They took him in, they took good care of him, and so the marriage was successful to him in that regard, certainly. But that's a good question, and just because I haven't found material on it doesn't mean it's not out there.
Another question from Michael is his grammar deemed technically well done?
That is such a good question, and if I were a Hebrew grammarian, if I were competent, I'd be able to give you a first-hand response. But I can tell you that there's a lot of scholars on this topic, including a couple people I mentioned earlier today, like Israel Ben-Porat, who might be in the audience today, who is better equipped to answer this question. I think there are aspects of his grammar that are technically faulty. He also, as a supplement, he issued a sort of a vocabulary list that scholars have scoffed at as being sort of inefficient and incorrect and inconsistent. But the bigger question here is, would he have passed muster among Jewish scholars? And I think the answer to that is maybe not. And so that's why the career that he achieved for himself at Harvard, it makes it all the more interesting, because somehow or other the argument would be that he was able to pawn himself off on the unknowing Protestants. But then again, Cotton Mather was a very accomplished scholar of Hebrew, and Cotton Mather thought Monus was hot stuff. So, but again, I think there might be other people in the audience, and there are other scholars who are better equipped to assess the content of his grammar.
Felicia has an interesting question. Was Abigail Adams part of a conversion effort among the well-to-do Bostonians? I have a Julia Adams in my Jewish family from 1800s Boston.
Oh, that I don't know. Right. There was, at the time that I mentioned, the person I mentioned is Hannah Adams. She is, I believe, related to that family. There was a very influential organization at this time in the early United States that was a mission for converting Jews throughout the world. And whether Hannah Adams, if that's who we're asking about, whether she was in on that, I mean, there's certainly her history of the Jews has a certain dimension of missionary purpose to it, for sure. But this, in terms of this actual family and their interests in conversion, I don't know.
I actually had a question, which is, you mentioned that Monus was the first Jew to get a degree from Harvard, and then, of course, he had a 40-year career as a teacher and scholar. What is his legacy at Harvard? Does Harvard have, records of him? Do they talk about him as part of their institutional history?
They have a lot of records of him. A lot of the Monus material that's accessible to scholars is at Harvard. I don't, what I've looked at of his material pertains more to its scholarly value. It's, in other words, it's held and curated for its scholarly value to studies like this, as opposed to upholding the glorious history of Harvard. I'm not sure whether they brandish Judah Monus as a point of pride. Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Last question from Nancy. I'm curious about the skull and crossbones on the gravestone. I think that is a common to the period, but I don't know if it's unusual for a convert, or if there's anything you can tell us about that.
Yeah. So the skull and crossbones is a very common motif in New England gravestones, as I'm sure the viewer and other listeners are aware. And people, archaeologists and people who study the material culture of early New England, usually interpret its occurrence in New England cemeteries as indicative of let's say, an earlier stage of Calvinistic thinking. And the assumption there is that the skull and crossbones is telling passersby that the person interred there is just a pile of bones, and that we don't know where his soul or her soul is. The assumption, again, if you go back to this predestinarianism, there's nobody wants to assume that the soul has ascended to heaven. And so earlier stones represent the skull and crossbones, but eventually the skull and crossbones, in fascinating ways, if you look at enough cemeteries, you see it evolves into a figure that looks very similar to it, that scholars call a winged cherub. And there you're beginning to see indications that, oh, well, maybe, it's got wings, it's an angel. In other words, the Calvinism is weakening, and there's more of an assumption that the person buried there that their soul might very well be in heaven. Eventually, when you get to the earlier part of the 19th century, those are gone as well, and what you have is an urn and willow, which people have associated with the notion that the body is insignificant here. What we're remembering here is the soul of this glorious person who, without question, is living a life in heaven right now. So the skull and crossbones, if it represents anything, it would represent, in this case, a firmer Calvinistic belief on the part of the people who put it there. And 1764 is relatively late for that motif, actually, because typically you'll see those for earlier decades. It's interesting that the way this works. I know that I'm going off on a tangent here, but it might people might be interested in it. The farther west you go, the slower the progress is. So when you get into western Massachusetts, for instance, the skull and crossbones sticks around for a few more decades. The trends are all made in Boston.
Fascinating. That is all the time we have for questions today. If any of you in the audience have further questions or want to learn more, please contact us at jhcreference@nehgs.org. And I want to thank Michael Hoberman again and thank all of you in our audience for joining us today. You will have the opportunity to fill out a survey as you leave the webinar, and we really appreciate your taking the time to do this, as your feedback is very valuable to us and helps us develop further programming. I also want to mention that this free webinar was made possible by contributions to the Jewish Heritage Center and New England Historic Genealogical Society from people all over the world. We would appreciate it if you would consider making a donation of your own to help us create more free programs. I invite you to learn more about the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center on our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. We hope to see you again on Tuesday, June 30th, when we hear again from Michael Hoberman about Jews in rural New England. Until then, please stay healthy and enjoy the summer. Thank you.